Newcastle United have appointed a new technical director, but the issue is he will be reporting to the sporting director who hasn't yet been appointed. We'll be discussing that, looking at a wider view of what Newcastle's transfer options are between now and Aston Villa, and also news of Tino Livramento potentially getting offered a new contract to ward off interest from Manchester City. That's all coming up in today's NUFC Transfer Daily, and let's get into it. Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Sorry this video may be a little bit late because I was struggling on deciding the big headline to talk about today. I looked at the rumoured players Newcastle are interested in, and as I said right at the very start of these videos, I didn't want to just talk about any rumour. If I didn't think it was legitimate or I didn't think it was likely, I wouldn't bring to the table. So that was kiboshed a little bit. I'm going to be talking a little bit more generally about what Newcastle are thinking and what the next steps are, both in terms of the striker and the centre-back and also the goalkeeper, because Manchester City are obviously interested in James Trafford, and there's been a little bit of an update on that as well, so we'll get into all of that today. But before we do, please do like, share and subscribe, hit the thumbs up on this video and join the community. And also thank you so much to everybody in the comments yesterday who got really involved in giving me some feedback on what they want to see next season. But without further ado, Newcastle United did make a new signing yesterday, and unfortunately it wasn't a new striker or a new centre-back. They appointed a new technical director. Sedation Gopaladasikan is the new man from Atalanta. He's arrived and will report to the sporting director, as I said in the intro, but the sporting director hasn't been appointed, which I think really does sort of point to an issue that Newcastle have, which is that they aren't appointing people in the right order. I mean, that is effectively the source of the frustration between Eddie Howe and the previous sporting directors, is they came in a little bit later than him and the power dynamic wasn't right. Really, I mean, the sporting director should be the very first hire you make, and then everything happens below that. And I think certainly in this case, no appointments really should be made in an ideal world until the sporting director, and actually until the CEO is appointed. Neither of those positions have been appointed, but the technical director has been. He's known as Suds and he's extremely highly rated. He's basically going to be dealing with data and implementing more data analysis across various different departments. At Atalanta, he's very heavily involved in recruitment, and there's a couple of really good talks that he's done on YouTube, which I watched last night, so you didn't have to. And I got a little bit more information and some thoughts why I think he could be a good appointment, why I think it'll work out. He's going to report to the sporting director that hasn't yet been appointed. Jason Ato and Ross Wilson from Nottingham Forest are the two options there apparently, and then there's obviously Canadian David Hopkinson, who's worked with Real Madrid, who is favourite to be the CEO. A couple of things that really did give me a little bit of encouragement from these talks that he did. One is that he was mainly used in recruitment because he admitted that that's where data is most accessible and it's easiest to see the results from what he's bringing into the table, because you can see how many goals the players scored, how much value they've saved, how much profit they've brought in when they've sold. That's what he was sort of saying, and it makes a lot of sense. The really interesting thing, which is very, I think, relevant to what I was talking about yesterday, and I also wrote a piece on Newcastle's transfer strategy, which is down in the description on Forbes yesterday, is that he was speaking about the creating algorithms that help understand the risk assessment between bringing a player from one league to another, and he sort of created the analogy that was like changing currency from pounds to euros, and that's a really interesting thing, because I think if you can understand the risks of bringing a player from a different league, that's a big reason why I think Eddie Howe wants Premier League proven players. So if that can come in and there's an algorithm, or at least a statistical understanding of maybe how a player may well do and the prediction of how they'll step up from a different league, that could really help Newcastle get better value out of a player than they are currently, or than they're worried about getting, which is why they're not moving for players that aren't already, in inverted commas, guarantees in terms of Premier League proven and that sort of thing. The other thing that he says is that all of these people he works with are incredibly intelligent, but they're not necessarily statistically intelligent or mathematically intelligent. They've got different intelligences, and he again said with an analogy, it's like everyone's got a Rubik's Cube and his job is to help them solve their own individual Rubik's Cube, put his input across in a way that best helps everybody understand what he can do. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on his work. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on data and the impacts and the intricacies and the impacts that it can really have. But we've seen with clubs that use it, Brighton and Brentford in the Premier League, other clubs, Liverpool have got a Moneyball strategy with a very heavily data-led recruitment drive as well. Lots of these clubs have gained real advantages by using data. Newcastle obviously have used data, they do use it, but they see this as a way to make it a better operation across the board, and he has done that at Atalanta, and it's particularly what he was saying about the recruitment thing. If you look at someone like Ademola Lookman, he was very poor in the Premier League. His reputation was very low when he went to Atalanta, and then suddenly he has become, arguably one of the best wingers in Europe, and he's about to sign for Inter Milan for about 40 million euros. He sounds very much like a sort of James Bunce type appointment in terms of he's the performance director. He's come in and basically his job is to try and make Eddie Howe's life easier, helping them understand injuries and what was making players more susceptible in the previous season. Obviously, they had a really good season in terms of that last year, and that was all down to James Bunce's input and the way he worked with Eddie Howe. If this guy can come in and do very similar things and help in similar ways, I think that's a real positive, and there won't be a challenge from him. He's just here to be a cog in the machine. Obviously, the bigger questions are there if there's a new CEO, if there's a new sporting director, and how they work with Eddie Howe and the existing team that's involved. But in terms of this guy coming from Atalanta, I think it's an excellent appointment based on what I've seen from these clips and hearing him speak last night. I did quite a bit of extensive research, so you didn't have to, as I say. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. I'm not going to suggest that he's going to revolutionise the way Newcastle do things. But the really interesting thing that I took about it was the algorithms that he's created and the understanding that he wants to bring of risk assessment from one league to another, because that'll help Newcastle's recruitment immeasurably, because the biggest issue they've had this summer has been trying to get Premier League proven players against rivals that can pay more money and not taking the risks on other players from different leagues, because there's no guarantee that they'll hit the ground running, and that is what has created this sort of feeling of stagnation in the window. So yeah, good appointment by the sounds of it, and we'll see how it develops. But really, Newcastle need a CEO and a sporting director to make things run as smoothly as possible. The big chunk of what I really wanted to talk about today was the striker situation. Did I want to discuss an option of the player that I think Newcastle should go for? Did I want to discuss a rumour? There are a couple that were flying around. I mean, I know Randall Kolo-Muani has been linked again in the last couple of days, but I did a video on him a few weeks ago. I really do think that is purely just agent talk. But there is a question that I think does need asking, which is that, what do Newcastle want out of this striker now? Because the Ekitike thing suggests, and as I've said previously around Ekitike, he was the target. It doesn't necessarily mean that Newcastle are going to go and spend another £70 million on a different option, but Ekitike being the target did open a few doors, and there was a lot of sense involved in the idea of bringing him in for a long-term succession plan to Alexander Isak, because the talk around Isak isn't going to go away. Even if he signs a new contract, the reality is there'll be a lot of talk about Isak next summer, and it could be that Newcastle do feel like they have to sell him at that point. So there has to be a succession plan in place. Do Newcastle go and look for another striker of the Isak mould, like Ekitike, like Samu, who we discussed at Porto, for example? Or do they look for a more stopgap option like a Johan Visser, who would probably cost, I think, even though there's different valuations, 50 million, 40 million, 30 million, I think you would probably look at Newcastle doing a deal most likely around 30, 35 if that was to happen. Let's talk again that there's an agreement in place in terms of personal terms. I'm not sure that's the case. I don't think it's nearly that far on, but he isn't going to sign a new contract at Brentford. Obviously, they've just sold Brian and Mbeumo, and a lot of you in the comment section were desperately keen to tell me that they wouldn't sell both. I haven't said that they would sell both, but Newcastle are interested in Johan Visser as a possible option. Do they want the more expensive Isak succession plan and then look at signing a Wilson replacement effectively next summer, or do they want a Wilson replacement directly and sort of very much the same mould and, to play behind Isak and not sort of complain too much, which is Visser, probably Dominic Calvert-Lewin's on that list as well, and there's various options. 30 to 35 million is a good option for centre-back. You can get some very good upgrades at that position. The goalkeeper situation we'll talk about in a second is very murky at the moment, but do they have money earmarked for that position, or do they just want to go and splurge a little bit more on the striker? And I think Samu's a great example of somebody who would who would come in very much at sort of the same level that Isak was at. He scored 19 goals last season in Portugal, which is obviously it would require a big step up, but I think if he came in now and developed alongside Isak, played in the Champions League, he'd be ready for next season. Moise Kean is the one I would absolutely go for now. The release clause he had in his contract of €52 million has just expired, but Fiorentina are likely to be able to negotiate a deal because I think he would like a Premier League move. He scored 20 goals last season in Serie A, very much similar sort of build and physique there. Callum Wilson got power though, and also can play crucially on both wings as well. So he would be the player that I look at as a good value option compared to Samu. He's a good middle ground, I would say, in terms of value, but also in terms of what he can bring. We've spoken about this all before, but there's a big question of what Newcastle want to do, and according to Chris Waugh in The Athletic on the deal sheet this morning, Newcastle are not rushing into any decision. It's understandable that they want to take stock after such a difficult summer, particularly in the last week, having such a damaging situation with the Ekitike deal, trying to get those both over the line, and also Alexander Isak, the rumbling on there as well, and the situation that's going on, it's not ideal. Obviously they've got centre-back to think about as well, but to me, they need to be quick in what they do, and there's an opportunity to go and sign Moise Kean for a decent deal for a couple of weeks in July. I would have exercised that opportunity, or at least tried to push at that stage, put pressure on Fiorentina. But it's something that I would certainly look at. As I say, we've been through his stats, we've talked about his versatility, his physique, his power. Lots of people are probably concerned about the Everton situation, that he failed at Everton, but he was very young at the time. I think he's matured a lot. This great season at Fiorentina is why I think he's the ideal player to come in. He would be able to play a lot of games in various different positions. Could he then step into Isak's position next season, or then do Newcastle look for another top striker? I think the great thing about Moise Kean is that he would push that question down the line a little bit. There wouldn't have to be that sort of definitive answer, whereas if you go for Samu now, you've got your plan in place. If you go for Calvert-Lewin, there's no way he's going to be a long-term replacement for Isak or Wilson or anything. He's just a stopgap, whereas you get the sort of best of both worlds, I would say, with Moise Kean. But yeah, Newcastle not rushing into anything, which you can kind of understand, but also time is of the essence. Manchester United have also been interested in Moise Kean as well. There's obviously Benjamin Sesko that's been linked there as well. Ekitike they apparently made a move for last week. Ollie Watkins. These players are all very much linked with Newcastle as well in various different forms. For me, I don't know how likely it is that Newcastle make this move, but for me, Moise Kean ticks all the boxes, as I've said in the previous video. For up front, would not necessarily eat into the budget in the way that Ekitike would or Samu would. That would leave some money for the centre-back and also the goalkeeping situation. Just quickly on James Trafford, the situation basically is that Man City are interested. They probably need to sell Ederson or Ortega to get into a position to sign him. They've got a 40 million buyback that they don't want to pay. But crucially, the update that emerged this morning, if Newcastle were to negotiate a lower fee and agree a lower fee with Burnley, Manchester City would have 3 days to match that, and apparently Trafford is very keen on joining Manchester City. So this one feels like it's got away from Newcastle. If I was them, I would move on. They've looked at Chevalier from Lille. They've looked at other people as well. But most likely, I think that Newcastle would probably shelve the goalkeeper situation again. And I know it's kicking the can down the road again, which isn't ideal. They would back Pope, and that would be the way they would go, and they would probably put a bit more money into the striker and the centre-back situation as well. We've discussed plenty of those. There'll be more to come on the centre-back later this week as well, I'm sure. And also the long-staff replacement. In an ideal world, they would go and find somebody to do that job as well. And I think that's an opportunity to be creative and go and find an up-and-coming midfielder, young midfielder who has potential but hasn't played at the highest level. I think that's the opportunity to sort of take a few risks and see how far that goes. We'll see on that down the line as well. But Newcastle aren't rushing into anything, but I do think they need to get on with it very quickly. Finally, just also talking about Manchester City, Tino Livramento is going to be offered a new contract, according to the Times, to try and ease the speculation over his future and commit him for a longer term. He's got 3 years on his current deal, but it would be more about, I think, upping his wages and making him feel more valued. Manchester City really want him, and they have been linked with him all summer, but they haven't made a move. There's a feeling that they don't feel they can get him this year, and there's been linked with Jules Koundé as an alternative from Barcelona this morning. And there is a sort of sense that Newcastle are in a very strong position. The noise that came out was that Man City were willing to pay sort of 65 million. Newcastle would want 165. I have said previously that this is the worst summer to try and buy from Newcastle in terms of their stance, because they've got good money to spend. They're looking to build in the Champions League. They need to keep their key players. That's the most important thing this summer, because they're obviously struggling to sign new players. So the best thing to do is keep the existing players that they've got. And somebody like Livramento is clearly one of the best right backs in the league and needs to be kept to grow the team further. So I think Manchester City are going to struggle to do this deal. Whether Livramento signs a new contract, I think it's very similar to Isak, 3 years left on it. Does he want to commit his best years to Newcastle and tie himself like that? Honestly, I'd be very surprised if he sat down and signed a new contract at this stage with so long left on his existing deal, and power in his position becomes key. If Newcastle don't qualify for the Champions League next season, a lot of these players are probably going to be thinking about their futures, and that is the difficult situation that Newcastle are in. They're in a sort of position where they constantly have to keep growing and keep improving to maintain these players. And player trading has been a thing that the Saudi PIF have earmarked as something that they want to do. They haven't yet done it, and with these situations, all of these players that are interested, eventually maybe they will have to step in to have a conversation about these players. We've talked about Isak next summer, we've talked about Gordon previously, Livramento as well down the line. I think he'll stay this summer, but this season is absolutely huge for a number of reasons, and I'd be very surprised, honestly, if he signed a new contract at this stage, but we'll see how it goes. Thanks so much for joining me on today's episode. Like, share and subscribe as usual. I'll be back tomorrow. If you have any thoughts on what you want to see from September onwards, let me know in the comment section and continue to have that discussion. Any thoughts on Livramento, on my striker analysis, or on the new technical director as well, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you tomorrow. Cheers.